Hello. There are a lot of you. Welcome. I'm Andrea Lawlor, and as you know, this is Garth Greenwell, whose Cleanness we're all here to celebrate.
Woo!
Thank you all so much. Thank you.
We're going to just jump right into the conversation that we've just started. This is the first time we've met in real life. I don't know if any of you have friends from the internet, and then you meet them in real life. So this is happening in
It's
real
everything
time.
I dreamed, actually.
Yeah.
More.
There's a lot of fanning going on in my part. So one of the things I wanted to do is just start right in talking about cleanness. One of the things you've talked about with this book, that you're a former opera singer, and which is very exciting, and you've talked about the ways in which you see this as a song cycle rather than a novel or necessarily a collection of short stories. And I wonder if you could tell us more about that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's such a pretentious thing to say. I mean, I can't bear myself, but it is true. You know, my first education in the arts, my first education in art was in music. I feel like everything I know about writing comes from my training as a singer. For better and for worse, everything I think about narrative and drama and narrative construction comes from opera. And also my sense of structure, my sense of kind of deep structure of how wholes can be made of parts comes from music. And, you know, as I was working on the book, I wasn't thinking of it as a book. You know, I wrote the first few sections, I mean, the earliest sections that were written, which are not the earliest sections in the book, I wrote while I was working on What Belongs to You.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I knew that What Belongs to You, which is about an obsessive relationship, had to be obsessively focused. Mm-hmm. And I knew that the world was bigger. And that was bearable to me because I knew there was this, I knew that I could, because I was writing these little pieces. But at a certain point, when I became aware that there was a book, I started to think of it not as a novel. I thought of and not as a story collection, I thought of these pieces that I was writing as sort of centers of intensity. Mm. And, you know, I'll tell you, the moment I knew it was a book, it was actually when I wrote the second chapter, what would become the second chapter, Gospodar, which was the first fiction I wrote after finishing What Belongs to You. It was the first fiction I wrote after coming back to the United States. Mm. It's the first fiction I wrote in Iowa City. I remember, I mean, I can see now the table where I sat every morning in High Ground Cafe in Iowa City writing this scene. I remember the terror I felt as I wrote it. It's a very intense S&M encounter that goes bad. When I finished that, which is the story of this S&M encounter told from the perspective of the submissive, it called into existence a companion. Mm. I knew that I had to write a story from the perspective of the dominant. I wouldn't write that for years. It's now the second to last chapter in the book, The Little Saint. But the fact that it called that into existence made the book. Like the fact that it was a book became clear to me. These 9 centers of intensity that I think of as being in a relation like a kind of constellation. Like they're not connected by chronology, they're not connected by the cause and consequence of plot, but there is a kind of charged relation between them that sort of holds them in place. And there are mirrorings and thematic connections. And the model for that, for me, is Schubert. And especially Schubert's Liedercycle, Winterreise, Winter Journey. And so, you know, I mean, I can't believe that people actually let me get away with this. Like, people are letting me say it's a song, but that's really true. I mean, that's really, like in an ideal world, I would say Cleanness, a liter cycle.
Oh, that's lovely. And that actually, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, reading the pieces, some of which I'd read in the New Yorker, as I imagine others have read, was thinking about the ordering that you did and wondering how that related to music once I'd gotten my head around this idea of the song cycle.
Yeah.
There are 3 discrete sections. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship amongst those sections for you.
Yeah, so, the first thing that I knew about the structure after I realized it was a book, and, I knew the heart of it would be the story of this transformative love relationship that the narrator has with a younger college student named R, who appears in What Belongs to You. And some people were really annoyed because R appears in What Belongs to You, and he's important in the 3rd section, but we only ever see him like on Skype, and we don't know anything about him. And people were like, "Who is he? And why isn't the book telling us this story?" And I thought, well, just hold on, it'll come. I knew that would be the heart, and that I knew did need to be chronological. I knew there needed to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. I also knew, and so that was my earliest intuition. My next intuition was that by the time we got there, we had to know the whole arc of that relationship. We had to know it had ended. We had to know that the narrator, when it ended, would be devastated, and that he would have to navigate a world transformed by an experience of love that he had lost. That was all I knew. And I figured out the rest, the achronological ordering of the 1st and 3rd sections really slowly, and by trial and error and sort of feeling it out.
That makes so much sense. And it also makes sense knowing again that you were a poet, that you started writing as a poet, thinking about that play with the ordering and the chronology.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was sort of, I still, and I shouldn't say this because, I teach fiction
still are
now.
A poet now.
Well, I haven't written poetry for years, but it's hard for me to think of myself as a fiction writer, I don't, when I listen to like fiction writers like my friend Jamel Brinkley, who's a great genius, and an extraordinary kind of technician, it's just a radically different way of thinking about it, writing fiction for me is feeling my way forward in the dark, kind of inch by inch. And, the technology that I have for navigation is the sentence. And, the whole time I wrote What Belongs to You, I never thought of it as I'm writing a novel. That would have terrified me. I would have been frozen. I said to myself, I'm writing sentences. And, and I do think that, like, I often thought that writing poetry, it's this sort of slow movement, and your guide is turning toward heat. Where is the heat? Where is the emotional intensity? Which is, again, a kind of musical way of thinking about it.
Absolutely.
Like how does this dissonance want to resolve or not resolve? And that the sentence is, kind of this heat-seeking device. I think of it very much like that. I try to feel, when I'm writing, I try to sort of be responsive to what feels to me like an energy that is not my own agency, that is being produced by the sentence. And that, the sentence wants to go a certain way, and I either acquiesce or I try to outwit it, and that's sort of the pleasure to be had. I never think in terms of narrative, I think in terms of sort of a lyric relation to time. What I like to do is to take something, a dilemma, a scene, a relationship, a situation that feels to me like an abyss, something that I don't know how to think about, that I can't make an argument about, that I couldn't make a judgment about. And then my way of thinking about it is inhabiting a moment in the way that a poem does, and freezing it, and then trying to sort of wring it dry, to sort of say, this moment feels to me like it has a kind of resonance because it has this sort of densely impacted signification. And what I want to do in these weird sentences I write is to try to create a space where that can be unpacked, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think that's beautiful, and it's one of the pleasures for me of reading your work is that sort of thinking along with you. And I think also it's funny to me that you don't think of yourself as a fiction writer.
Yeah, it's really true. I mean,
does anybody? It's like maybe one of those things. Well, like, can any of us think of ourselves as fiction? Right. But here we are at the Center for Fiction, so probably.
I mean, I guess somebody does. But maybe we should get memberships at the Center for Fiction. Then we'd be fiction.
That will validate our
I feel like
identities.
It would. Do you get a card? Like,
novelist. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the first encounter I had with your thinking was in the review, and I think the review you wrote of A Little Life many years ago, after your first book came out, but before What Belongs to You.
Yeah, after the little novella came out. Yeah,
right before What Belongs to You. And I remember, it was one of those moments where I thought, I need to meet this person. I need to know this person. I need to read what this person is reading, and hopefully one day we'll talk about it. But I remember you were writing about the book as a sort of expression of queer suffering.
Right.
And you were talking about how you, in your youth, had come to James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, as did I, also in my youth, and had the response to it that there was a dignity in it, and it may have been a dignity of tragedy, but it was dignity nonetheless, and the dignity of queer desire.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in the way that you got from that place to sort of like grasping at Giovanni's Room, which is such a gorgeous book and so painful.
So painful.
To where your work is now, and thinking a lot about especially the centerpiece of Cleanness, the Frog Prince, which to me is it's so the tenderness in your representation of the sex in that story seems so, and the desire in that story seems. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
Not to send you back to your youth.
Oh God. But I mean, that is where we always are. I mean, in large part, I think the project of What Belongs to You was to try to figure out what to do with the inheritance that was my childhood in a place that taught me certain lessons about my life, that taught me that my life lacked dignity, that my life lacked value, and what to do with the fact that even though through years of activism and years of queer art making, and even though everything I value about my life comes from queerness, everything that gives me joy in my life comes from queerness, I will never get to be someone who was not taught those lessons. And it felt to me very wrong and very dangerous to try to pretend that shame wasn't there. The rhetoric of pride is life-giving. When I was 14 or 15 and saw my first Pride Parade in Louisville, Kentucky, what an astonishing thing. Thank God that exists. But I don't think anything good comes from trying to sort of aggressively proclaim a rhetoric of pride as a way of shouting down shame. I actually think shame, so I find queer people endlessly inspiring. I find queer survival endlessly inspiring. Queer people are geniuses of transformation. And, the whole history of queer art is taking shame and stigma and turning it into style. The whole history of queer activism is taking stigma and turning it into solidarity. I think one of the histories of queer desire and of queer eros is taking stigma and making it productive of pleasure. If I can take the language of my father and, in a certain context, in a kind of aesthetically created space that, say, an S&M encounter can be. If I can take the word that lacerated me when I was 12 years old, when my father said, if I'd known you would be a faggot, you would never have been born. And if that word coming from a lover, if the word faggot directed at me from a lover's mouth gives me access to a kind of pleasure and a kind of rapture that I have no access to, that seems to me extraordinary. That doesn't seem to me wallowing in shame in some way that is destructive of sort of my sense of self. It seems the contrary. It seems that I have taken this pain and made it productive of pleasure in a way that is to me a mode of survival. You know, I think if you repress something, it will always erupt in ways that are devastating. But if you face up to it, and if you enter into it, and if you try to worry it, I can't solve it. There's not some puzzle of myself I can find a solution to that will make, you know, what belongs to me, the inheritance I bear, disappear. But if I can worry it, if I can keep trying to make things out of it, if I can keep putting it into new contexts, if I can make it productive, then maybe there's a way that in negation, somehow, one slips into affirmation. And you know, I don't want to romanticize this. You know, it was important to me to write a story like Gospodar, in which that sort of technology of transformation I just described doesn't work. And the narrator is in a terrifying and devastating place by the end. Yeah. But then it was also really important for me to write a story in which it does work.
In The Little Saint.
In The Little Saint. Where, you know, I think when I wrote that story, so this is this S&M encounter where the narrator is the Dom. And, you know, I think I wrote that The Little Saint, which is this character he meets off the internet, he's fascinated because the internet profile says, first of all, it has excellent English, excellent pornographic English, and it says, no limits whore. And the narrator says, what does that mean here? And then the narrator, who in the grief of having lost R has been seeking out more and more extreme experiences, he wants to be on the other side of that. He wants to know what that feels like. And I think when I titled it The Little Saint, when I started it, because I knew it was going to be titled The Little Saint very early on, I think I thought there was a kind of irony in that, you know, because he's like really not saintly. Like he wants to do really dirty things. But then by the time I finished it, I realized that no, actually there's zero irony. It's absolutely earnest. He shows the narrator a way to this kind of transformation, and he shifts things to a different key.
Would you read us some of it?
Yeah, why not? Are you guys okay if we read maybe a little? I love Brooklyn. I feel like Iowa City might not. Well, no, you know what? I'm not going to slam Iowa City. Iowa City constantly surprises me. Iowa City is super. My brilliant friend Brandon Taylor and I are determined to make Iowa City the center of queer culture in America. So y'all have to come. Okay, so I'm just going to read the last 2 paragraphs of this. I think I've given you enough context, both in terms of just narratively what's going on, and then also in terms of the kind of language that's used and the kind of feeling these people are seeking out. The little saint has just, he's just asked the narrator to whip him with his belt, which is something the narrator did not sign up for and was very uncomfortable with, but does. And, you know, in a way that I think desire and pleasure can be extraordinary educations for us, and in a way that I think we think we know too much about what we desire. Like, I don't know how people use Grindr filters. You know, like, I look at these things and like, you can filter for all of these things, and I think, but how do you know? How do you know you like this body type? How do you know you like this age? I mean, the wonderful thing about analog cruising, which, you know, I think is like an absolutely essential democratic institution, is that you can be surprised by desire.
The one bite rule.
What now?
I'm awkwardly going to talk about parenting. You have to take one bite before you decide you don't like it.
Oh, I went a really different place. I went a really different place, but I like that too. Yes, the one bite rule. I think when cruising too, you should have a taste before you decide. No, it's true, you know, so that, I mean, I do feel sometimes when people ask, do people ask me this? Like, what's your type? And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, you know, because when you're cruising, it's wonderful because so much can turn you on. You know, the way someone smells, the way someone moves, the sound of someone's voice. You know, the idea that I could know enough about my desire, that I could like set an algorithm, I just think that's terrible. I mean, and what's, you know, the surprise of desire, and that's what happens here. You know, the narrator has never thought he might get pleasure from beating someone. And then he discovers that he does. And that discovery is not a comfortable one for him. And he's just finished beating him. I should also say the narrator is very aware that Bulgaria is a place where HIV is rampant, and many people are positive without knowing. And so this young man, another thing in his profile is he says, you can only fuck me bare. And the narrator has thought he won't do that, but that's a step too far. But then, I was hard again. Beating him had made me hard. I didn't know I could enjoy someone suffering that way, but I did enjoy it. I wanted him to suffer more. When my arm was tired, I raised it above my head, my right arm, and brought it down harder, not on his ass, but on his back, which I struck 3 times very fast and with all my strength. He cried out sharply, a cry of real pain, pinched and high-pitched, but he didn't break his position. He stayed crouched with his hands clasped beneath his head. Nor did he move when I dropped the belt and climbed onto the bed behind him. I had thought I wouldn't fuck him, but I wanted to fuck him now. I had to do it. It was a kind of compulsion, a necessary conclusion to what he had made me feel. I needed to be inside him. His ass was red from the beating. It was hot to the touch when I smacked him, which elicited another cry, more of surprise than of pain, I thought. I spit into the same hand and slicked my cock with it just a little. I knew I was close. If I stroked myself too hard, I would come too soon. And also, I didn't want to be too slick. I wanted him to feel it. I had opened him up already. He would still be wet from my hand. But I didn't want it to be too easy for him. I wanted it to hurt. I lined myself up and then hesitated, remembering my earlier worries about disease, the men who had fucked him and me. It was a stupid risk. But then he leaned back until he touched my cock, his hole tightening like a mouth again, and I didn't care about disease or anything else. If there was a risk, we would share that too, and in a single motion I made him take it all. I held still for a moment, waiting for the pleasure to dull. When I pulled back, he tightened against me, his body straining to hold me in, and then I took his narrow pelvis in both hands and fucked him hard. Yes, he said again, yes. But it didn't annoy me now. It had become sweet to me. I liked it when he said, fuck me, when he said, fuck me harder, that inane dialogue. I'll fuck you, I said. I'll fuck you hard. Take it, I said, pulling on him as I thrust forward, slamming him against me. He had lifted himself onto his hands again, and he arched his back, pushing into me. Like that, he said, like that, make me your whore. And I laughed a little. I said, is that what you want? You want to be my whore? I slapped him then hard on his ass, and he groaned. Please, he said, his voice electric with need. Please, fuck me like your whore. I want to be your faggot whore. And at the sound of it, I felt something move in me like a shifting of gears. That's right, I said. You're my faggot whore. And then I shoved him down hard and fell on top of him, pinning him beneath my weight. I hooked my arm beneath his neck and pulled his face close to mine, choking him. You faggot, I said, fucking him more slowly but more savagely, digging into him. You worthless faggot. My voice was low now. I was speaking into his ear. You know what you are, I said. You are a whore. This is all you're good for, I said. This is all you deserve. Maybe they had always been there, these words. Maybe once you have heard such language, it infects you. That was what it felt like something bursting free in me, corrosive and hot without end. I had been waiting my entire life to say those words. I lifted my head and spat on his face twice in quick succession, saying faggot each time, you dirty faggot. And he cried out again, his eyes clenched shut. I smeared the saliva on his face and left my hand on his head, leaning on him, forcing his face into the thin mattress against the hard wood beneath it. Please, he said again, his voice muffled, please, I'm nothing. He repeated this, I'm nothing, I'm nothing. And I echoed him. I said, that's right. I was fucking him with my whole body, lifting up and falling back on him. You're a faggot, I said. You're nothing. You're a faggot. You're nothing. I hammered into him as I felt it rise in me, that cruelty and rage, that acid grief. And when I came, I felt him come beneath me, his body shaking. I heard him give a cry of joy. I hung over him, letting him grow still, then pulled out and fell onto my back beside him. Mnogo hubavo bish, he said. That was good. Speaking Bulgarian for the first time, his face turned away. When I didn't answer, he turned toward me, then lifted himself onto his side. Hey, he said, his voice solicitous. Hey. I put my hand over my face, which was wet with tears. I was embarrassed. I didn't want him to see me. When he asked what was wrong, I couldn't answer. Stop it, he said, pulling my hand away. Stop it. Which made me cry harder somehow, and he kissed me, my forehead and cheeks, my lips. When I tried to pull away, he grabbed my head with both his hands, holding me in place. Sladurce, he said, sweet boy. Stop it now. Don't be like that. And then he licked my face quickly, playfully, like a cat. Everywhere he had kissed, he licked, catching my hands in his when I tried to shield myself or push him away, until I was laughing and weeping both. I stopped struggling and let him lick my face. He laughed too, rolling on top of me, still licking me. And I realized that I had been wrong before. It did have an end, what I had felt. Its end was here. He had brought me here. Finally, he laid his head on my chest. "Don't be like that," he said again as I put my arms around him. "Do you see? You don't have to be like that," he said. "You can be like this."
Jesus. I think we all need a minute. Just me. Garth, the way you write about sex, to me, is it's one of the things I love. It's not the only thing I love about your work, but I love the way you take sex so seriously.
Oh,
And
thank you.
I think that we have some of the same literary loves.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the books and the lineages that you're in conversation with or in reaction to when you're writing, this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do think sex is serious. I think it can be, I think sex is play. I think play is serious. And I think taking sex seriously gives access to, the biggest questions of human life. I mean, this idea, in 1999, John Updike wrote a review of Alan Hollinghurst's book, The Spell, that is kind of like a collective trauma in, sort of the consciousness of queer literature, in which basically he said about Alan Hollinghurst, that sublime genius, that, his books were just about sex. They were, the phrase is, relentlessly gay. And he makes this argument because it's not just that, I do think in literature, in art, sex is often not taken seriously. People talk about D.H. Lawrence in ways sometimes that are a little snide, a little dismissive because he's so fascinated by sex. I think especially when you're queer, and D.H. Lawrence also, he's really part of the family. But, queer sex especially, John Updike in that article said this thing where he said, straight sex between men and women, even if it's frivolous, even if it's, he was thinking of his novel Couples, like, even if, it's adulterous, even if it's like a swingers party, blah, 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 it still has this kind of connection to, he said, I think, the sacralizing structures of family and child raising. And so therefore there's a kind of charge to straight sex that queer sex doesn't have. Now, as I say, this is this was an argument that really was a kind of trauma. There was a group, and it was published in the New Yorker, right? In 1999, I had just started studying literature. I was at SUNY Purchase, and I remember when that review came out, I remember thinking, in the New Yorker, in like our magazine, this can be said. And the thing is, that, people have argued against it, but why would you argue against it? It's just homophobia. Like, don't take it seriously. It's just dumb.
Yeah.
And queer people, I think there is this vibrant tradition of queer thought that sees the truth, that the erotic is at the heart of politics. The erotic is at the heart of sociality. And, this radical queer tradition, which has been really important to me, of thinking that in sex one might find, and especially in, there's no good inoffensive term, but like non-normative sex, kinky sex, that one might, sex that maybe puts at risk our usual notions of the self. Sex that might take us to a place where we can say, I want to be nothing. Sex that might take us to a place where, in fact, we are reduced to nothing. And that from that profound negation, might come some radical new form of sociality. And you know, what the little saint does for the narrator in that story is he gives him a way not to deny shame, not to deny the hatred of others that makes up such a large part of himself, but instead to transform that, you know, to turn that into something that can be productive of laughter, something that can be productive of tenderness, something that can be productive of, you know, what I think is, to me, a very profound experience of each other's humanness. Yeah, I mean, you know, that there is a tradition of queer thinking that I think, you know, goes from what, Socrates to Tim Dean, that sees in Eros the possibility of social transformation. And, you know, I was tweeting about this earlier, that, you know, an annoying thing, I mean, you know, it's amazing to write a book and have anyone say anything at all about it, and people have been very kind, and I'm very grateful, but there have been a couple of reviews, well, there's been one review that has sort of said, you know, wow, the sex is really great, too bad there's not more politics. And I thought, what do you mean? Like the politics is on every page. Like, I mean, every that page. Passage to me is a profoundly political passage.
Absolutely.
You know, and yeah, it seems to me like a residual, that review, the person who wrote that review is very brilliant, and it was not in any way homophobic. But I do think that's a residue of this homophobic argument that sort of says queer sex must be frivolous. Right. Queer sex must be cut off from the big questions that really matter. Well, I mean, if I have any capital P project, a big part of it is just not arguing with that, but writing in the knowledge that it is false. Yeah.
That is, thank you for doing that work.
Thank you for doing that work.
Look forward to and you mentioned earlier when we were in another room with fewer people that you are working on another book that's set in the United States.
I know, shocking.
What's that about?
I know. You know, there was something valedictory about this book. There was something a little sad about this book. The last piece of Cleanness that was written is the third chapter, which is called Decent People, and which is set during these extraordinary street protests in Sofia against austerity, against, well, against the conditions of their lives, that were very joyful protests. And they involved walking around the center of the city, and the narrator walks around the center of the city. It's the longest chapter in the book. It was once almost twice as long.
Oh, wow.
In part because I knew it was the last thing I would write about Sofia. I felt, as I finished this book, you know, this place, the experience of which was absolutely transformative. I mean, I fell in love with this place. It's as profound a love as I have ever felt for a person, for this place, for this language. Bulgarian is the most beautiful language in the world. I miss it every day. And I just wanted to say goodbye to it was like Goodnight Moon. I wanted to say goodbye to everything, you know. And I remember my agent, when she read that version, was like, huh. I feel like it could be compressed, you know, and so I did, you know, I tore out a lot of stuff, but I had to, you know, I couldn't have written it without doing that, without just saying, goodbye, National Palace of Culture, goodbye, statue of Tsara Svobodito, goodbye, you know. So there was something kind of mournful in finishing the book. But yes, in fact, before finishing the book, I was already deeply invested in a new project. You know, one of them, I mean, What Belongs to You changed my life in every way. Maybe the most profound way it changed my life was that I went back to Louisville, my hometown, for the first time in 15 years more. You know, I ran away from Louisville at 16. I felt like Louisville was killing me. I think I was right. I think if I had stayed in Louisville, I would have died. I mean, I am very pro-promiscuity. I was having suicidal sex. Mm-hmm. I was trying to kill myself with sex at the height of the AIDS crisis. And it was really important that I discovered art, and that art gave me an escape. So, my father retired and left Louisville right before What Belongs to You came out, which meant I could go back. Mm. And FSG wanted me to go on book tour there, and so I did. And I ended up spending time in both Louisville and Lexington, and my little sisters, whom I adore, were both living in Louisville at the time. And they're these remarkable, fabulous, brilliant, very artistic people with friends that are all those things. And they and Louisville has changed a lot, imagine, since 1994. It's changed a lot. Parts of Louisville become super queer in a way that would have been unimaginable to me. And I felt like, first of all, I had a kind of chemical reaction to Louisville, this Louisville that I was re-encountering, that reminded me of the chemical reaction I felt to Sophia, which was, this place, I thought I knew everything I could ever want to know about Sophia, or about Louisville, when I left. And then when I went back at 38, I felt, I don't know anything about this place at all. And I need a book in order to think about it. And the other thing that happened is that I became aware, in large part because of conversations around What Belongs to You, that the University of Louisville has one of the largest regional LGBT historical archives in the United States. Mm. What?
Amazing.
The Williams-Nichols Archive. And I spent 6 weeks going all day and going through this archive. Oh my God.
That sounds amazing.
And it shouldn't have been a surprise. Queer people are everywhere, and therefore queer history is everywhere. But, if you guys have read Jordi Rosenberg's great novel, that's an extraordinary meditation on what it means to try to claim a history that has been lost through neglect and actively destroyed through malignity. And when I was 12, 13, 14, in desperate need of a history, I had no access to it. But to go back and to learn, first of all, about heroic activists, and especially heroic AIDS activists in the early 90s, right when I needed them, not far away, and yet I had no idea they existed, doing this incredible work, but then going back. I had no idea that Oscar Wilde stopped in Louisville on his US tour in the 1880s. And the Courier Journal article about Weird Oscar Wilde, who was not famous yet. It's one of the great cons of literary history. Wilde was not famous in England, so he went to America and did a tour as a famous Englishman in order to go back to England and be famous. What a queen. That's fabulous. So, but in the Courier Journal article about this weird Englishman, this dandy, this aesthete, these boys from Kentucky who showed up with carnations in their lapels.
Green carnations?
Green carnations in their lapels. How did they know? How was there enough of a community in Louisville in the 1890s, 1880s, that kind of symbol could resonate?
That's amazing.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So that's just so exciting to me. And I don't know what this project will be. I have a sense of the territories of it, but I just know I need to create this space in which I can think really hard about Kentucky then, about Kentucky now, about Kentucky when I was a kid, about friends that I had in the park, what it would mean to be an HIV-positive queer kid before protease inhibitors in rural Eastern Kentucky. I have to think about all that. And again, I can't think about it and argue. I don't want to make an argument about it. I can't figure it out. There are things that I can't figure out through reason. Like, I have to have the weird pressure of art. I have to have scene. I have to have a space I can inhabit. I have to have the weird, expansive but also recursive phenomenological consciousness-producing sentence that I'm addicted to in order to think about it. But it's very moving to me, and it really is because of what belongs to you and what it made possible, that now my childhood is not something I only have to run away from. Louisville is not something I only have to run away from. I cannot believe that I can say I think Louisville is an extraordinary city. I love Louisville. It allowed me to reclaim my past.
That's beautiful.
And that's what the next novel is going to be about.
That's really exciting.
Thank you.
Garth, it's been such an honor to talk to you.
The honor is all mine.
I don't want to be the only person who gets to ask you questions, and I know there are people here who probably have many things. We're going to open it up. If people have questions, I'll let you choose.
No, I hate choosing.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm so obsessed with the new book.
Oh, thank you.
I'm really interested in the way that you are always able to create these sort of miscreants who never stop being endearing in a way that feels very true to like a particular kind of queer ne'er-do-well that I think we all have sort of bumped into. And they sort of like haunt like bathrooms and Grindr and stuff. And I'm really interested in, this must have taken just lots of revision, if you found any ways in crafting characters who are probably inherently, if not bad, at least very rudderless. Like they're not necessarily good people. And I'm thinking of Mitko and some of these other characters who creep through the fiction. How do you always find a way to keep the reader rooting for them almost in spite of themselves? Even as you're watching these characters who are, we know either from personal experience or just been reading the subtext that they're disasters to be around.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I don't have a crafty answer. I love them. It's so interesting to talk to people about what belongs to you, because people often have really strong feelings, and they're sort of like team narrator, team Mitko, which I love. I mean, I think that's great. I mean, anytime someone has a feeling about something I've written, I think mission accomplished. But I love them both, and I think. I wanted to write in What Belongs to You a book about two people who each fail the other and are each inadequate to what the circumstances of their relationship might demand of them. Maybe it would be impossible to be adequate because of the structures in which they're placed, and yet it is just a fundamental belief of mine about human life that, any time you have human beings in a face-to-face encounter, that it's not that those structures fall away. It's not that, you solve them. Again, solution is just something I don't believe in. But that there is the possibility for a kind of human and humane surplus. And that there is a kind of overflow, an affective overflow, the potential for it. And that's a space of possibility, so that even though, in some way, what belongs to you is a story that is foreclosed from the beginning, what interested me were moments that disrupted that logic of finality. And, you know, Mitko to me, I mean, I actually don't think, I think he, you know, it's so funny. It's like the idea of judgment is so foreign to my sense of him. You know, I think there are moments where what flows between these two men is something profoundly affirmative. That doesn't make it a happy story, but it makes it an interesting story to me. But I mean, my only like craft advice for making characters is to love them. You know, if which doesn't mean you're not hard on them, and which doesn't mean you know, you can't have all sorts of complicated feelings about them. But you know, something that I look for in fiction, and this is not an objective. Like there are great writers who hate their characters, very great writers, and you just feel, wow, you hate these characters. Those are generally, while I may think they're great writers, they are generally not writers I love. Writers can be very hard on their characters. Thomas Hardy, I mean, I sometimes feel like Thomas Hardy had like dice of disaster. And he was like, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? Like, how much suffering can I inflict? You know, like, we are too many in Jude the Obscure. But he loves his characters. He loves Tess. And that makes Hardy a writer I love and don't just admire. So, I mean, my sense of character, I can't imagine writing a book about someone I didn't love, even if they did terrible things. We all do terrible things. We all fail each other. I mean, it is just my fundamental assumption about human life that we are all neck deep in the shit. And that purity, cleanness, is never available. And that if we become obsessed with its attainment, we will become engines of disaster. If instead we can acknowledge that we are all implicated and that we are all, that none of us has any right to righteousness. And if we can just give that up and say, well, what do we do now? You're in the shit, I'm in the shit. How can we address each other face to face as human beings and try to help? That to me is where we begin. You know, it's something that troubles me. I don't want to talk about this too much, but it's something that troubles me about the way in which the discourse, capital D discourse, the twitterings, the way in which problematic has become a term not of opening, but of closure. And that if something is declared problematic, it's not a way of saying, let's talk about it. What a problematic book. Read it and come to book club. No, it's what a problematic book. Set it down. Get it canceled. I hate that. I think it's anti-art. I think it's anti-human. I think any meaningful encounter between human beings is always necessarily problematic. That's where we begin. That's like any art that is serious. Any art that's asking real questions is going to be problematic. That's where we begin. You know, but there is nothing more dangerous, I think, in American politics right now than our addiction to our own sense of righteousness. Because what it does is it says, here is a situation in which I cannot be clean. I'm going to walk away from it. I think that's the end of, not just the end of liberal democracy, not just, you know, the end of these institutions that we like to depreciate because actually we can't imagine a world without them, and now we're staring into a world without them. It's also the end of sociality. And I don't want to only engage with other human beings on Twitter. So, problematic. I love a messy queen. And that's what my characters are, messy queens. Hi. Oh,
Hello.
yeah. Oh, sorry. Am I supposed to be choosing? I'm not choosing. You guys choose. Yeah,
I've
I don't
chosen
choose.
myself.
Yeah, that's... Amen. Queer beatitude. I choose myself.
So it's my understanding intellectually and experientially that people with excruciating childhoods often self-identify not only as incapable of making art, but as having nothing to contribute to the world or to say. And I'm just wondering, because you're such a master of language, what you might say to one such person who's interested in making art.
Wow. That's a profound question. I don't know that I have an answer to it. You know, I taught high school for 7 years. I worked with young people for 7 years. And a lot of that time was spent in sort of shock and horror at how the adults in their lives acted. You know, it was such an education, you know, because in my own childhood, you know, I think one accepts the world of one's childhood as how things should be. And there was a part of me that I think thought that I deserved things that happened to me in my childhood. And then when I taught 14-year-olds, and I could see what it actually means to be a 14-year-old, and I could see, oh no, actually these incredibly vulnerable beings, there's nothing they could do that would justify saying, you're not my son. And that was a radical transformation in me. You know, I don't know that one can say something to someone in that situation. I mean, it's funny because I'm a writer and I have lots of strong feelings about language, and yet I also have a real sense of the limitations of what language can do. And maybe especially in relationships with young people, you know, kids are such extraordinary detectors of bullshit. And I think, you know, you have to treat them in a way that recognizes that their lives have value. You know, my life, you know, so there's a funny story about how I became an opera singer. Funny, haha. Also funny, strange. My father kicked me out when I was 14, and because of that, because of the chaos, I was very lucky, although it's strange to say I was lucky. My parents divorced when I was 5. It was bitter and traumatic, and an extraordinary education in how parents weaponize their children, with an utter cruelty towards one another and an utter lack of regard for you know, the fact that these are sentient beings. And it was a trauma that continued. They were in court battles until I was 16. I mean, it was ridiculous. But that was very lucky because, you know, so many queer kids, when that happens to them, they're homeless. But I had a place to go. And while my mother had a long journey when it came to having a queer kid and accepting her queer kid, my father said to me what the narrator's father says to him in What Belongs to You, which was, if what you say about yourself is true, you're not welcome in my house. And my mother said, I hope so much that this isn't true, because it means a desolate life. But of course you have a place in my house. And of course I love you. My mother made clear in many ways when I was young that I acted in ways that shamed her. And that was painful and that caused damage. But she also made sure, not by saying it, but by showing it, that I knew that she loved me. And that made all the difference. And my mother, one of the great blessings of my life right now is that my partner, Louise, because my mother, God bless her, she's a handful. And she is now an older Southern woman. And I have a limited tolerance. And she and my partner, Louise, adore each other. They adore each other. And Louise says, I don't understand. How can you say she's annoying? She's so wonderful. And I say, you don't understand half of what she's saying. Like, that's the key. But they love each other. And my mom came to visit us. We bought a house recently. My mom came to visit us and saw our house. And I was kind of away. I was in another, around the corner. And I think she thought I couldn't hear her. And I heard her say to Louise, you are the best thing that's ever happened to my son. And I think, you know what? We had a journey. And it was hard. But now I am in a place, I cherish my mother. And, there was a kind of continuity, an affective continuity that allowed us both to grow, and that allowed me to allow her to grow and to come to a place where she could say that to my partner. But I was telling a story. So I went to my mother's house, but I failed when I was 14 and a freshman in high school. I failed freshman English, which is a story I love to tell my students because, occasionally when I had a student who was just an utter disaster, I would say, you don't come close. You have no idea what a real disaster. You don't scare me a bit, and you're going to be fine. But I failed freshman English. I was in a magnet school, which meant I had a major. I was a communications major. I don't know what that meant or means. But this guidance counselor, and what was maybe not the best advice ever given to a young person, said, well, you can't graduate on time as a communications major, so you should change your major. And I was like, okay, I don't care. And I looked at the brochure, and there was a choir major. And I thought, I sang in church choir. And I remember so clearly, these words, I still hear them in the voice I said them to myself, that will be the easiest option. And this is finally coming back to your question. The choir director in that public high school in Kentucky, DuPont Manual High School in Kentucky, was named David Brown. He was a brilliant singer, passionate about opera. He heard something in my voice. He started giving me voice lessons after school. He gave me CDs and videos of opera. He gave me tickets to the Kentucky Opera, which happens to be an excellent company. I saw Così fan tutte. The second opera I saw was Benjamin Britten's Turn of the Screw, which was my introduction to Henry James, and which blew my mind. I remember the first time he taught me to sing with my full voice. To sing with your whole body as you do when you're a classical singer. And just the revelation it was that something so big could come out of me. It suggested that there was a scale of myself I had never imagined. He was the first adult to treat me as though my life had dignity, and he saved my life. Not because of anything he said to me. He made art available, and he treated me in such a way that showed me, didn't argue it, didn't try to convince me, just showed me that it could be mine. And Benjamin Britten, when I encountered opera, I knew there was a world in which I might have a place. And it allowed me to survive. That's not, I don't think there's a line you can give. But teaching, I felt, my job was to see my students and to try to show them to themselves as I saw them, which was as human beings whose lives had a value that is infinite like all human value. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you.